Welcome and thank you all for joining us to this Young Women at Work webinar to learn how to better recognize and navigate the power and politics in the workplace. My name is Esther Elkos and I'm the Chair of Career Development and Networking Programs at the American Marketing Association, New York. First, we would like to thank our premier partner, Greenbook, a leading voice in the market research and consumer insight space, for supporting the AMA New York year-round. We also appreciate our board of directors and volunteers for their ongoing dedication and support to make events like this one happen. At AMA New York, we work every day to inspire, support, and celebrate brilliance in marketing. As a member, you have access to the most relevant knowledge base of data, tools, and people in the New York area. If you are not a member yet, I invite you to join this dynamic organization to access essential resources, expand your network through a full schedule of events around marketing skills, career readiness, and emerging trends. Network among your peers and connect with leaders who help shape the future of marketing, and elevate your leadership profile by volunteering, providing expertise, and mentoring. We offer a wide variety of programs, so make sure to subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media to stay tuned. As a recap, some of our upcoming events: on April 22nd, you can participate in a panel discussion on how to incorporate ROE in the marketing mix to empower customer-driven relationships with brands. On April 29, join our popular event, Cocktails in the Green Room, to network with marketers across the country. AMA chapter leaders will lead 10 breakout rooms for highly interactive conversations about issues in healthcare marketing, the state of marketing in the beginning of 2021, and other topics. And on May 6th, engage in a timely panel of experts to learn how successful healthcare brands have repositioned themselves to become more patient-centric and competitive. If you are interested in joining AMA New York, you can sign up on our website and feel free to contact us if you have any questions regarding membership. And now it's my pleasure to present our guest speaker. Jacqueline Strayer is a faculty member in graduate and executive programs at Columbia University and New York University. She consults on marketing, public relations, and leadership, and is a frequent speaker and moderator with professional groups around the world. A former elected officer of 3 public companies, her work, writing, and research focuses on the implications of contemporary issues and their implications for the practice. And now, without further ado, Jacqueline, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Esther. And it's really great to be with you today. And it's really exciting for me to be presenting this topic because it's one that we rarely talk about. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and start from the beginning. Here we go. So we're going to be talking about the subject of power and organizational politics. And what in terms of this content, it actually is connected to content that I teach in a graduate class at Columbia University called Human Behavior in the Organization. It also connects with another course that I teach at New York University called C-Suite Perspective, which is in the Integrated Marketing Masters. And so what we're going to be talking about is the notion of power and actually the politics as a result. I love this quote from the Harvard Business Review, which basically says, the more contaminated and corrosive the culture of an organization, the more parasitic individuals will rise, much like bacteria thrive in contaminated environments. So let's look at this topic. One of the things that I think is really interesting about power and organizational politics is we really don't talk about them in organization. They're sort of like the unseen, the unheard, and the unspoken topic, but they're prevalent. They're prevalent in all organizations, regardless of their size, and they play out in many of the same ways. So one of the things that I'd like you to do in the chat, if you would, is, and we would like to take a look at this, is when you enter an organization, when you're new in a job, how do you actually assess who has power in that organization? How do you actually think about that? And that's a really, really important aspect of how we consider how we navigate in an organizational setting. So if any of you have some experiences around this, you don't have to share anything particular details, but how do you know who has power? And with that, I'd like to share with you some aspects of how we actually know that it's there. So some telltale signs in terms of who's powerful in your organization, you go by their job title, vice president, director, manager. We can kind of see what their job title is, and that follows on in terms of where do they actually sit on the organizational chart, their positional power. And it's not just their title and where they sit, but actually who they report to and actually the people that, report to them. Or they can be highly regarded by those in power. So we notice that these people have people have an affiliative quality towards them because they can see that they're well regarded in the organization. And also, you can also sometimes tell, and one of my students at Columbia recently brought this up in a class discussion, people listen to them when they speak. So if you're in a meeting and all of a sudden people take up and take notice of them, you can kind of see that people are paying attention to them. Also, there can be what we call an organizational reliance, where people actually need them for some reason or other. And so we see that they're powerful because of that. Or they've achieved some sort of notoriety, whether it's inside the organization, externally, they may be published, they may be a speaker, they may have won awards. And all of a sudden, you see that they have that level of notoriety. Or they can be seen as an untouchable person. Sometimes organizations have people that the C-suite or a senior leader basically has such a regard for this person that you're hands off, that this person is a protected person in the organization. Or you can see that this person has a significant influence in decision making in the organization. Or finally, they have longevity, which gives them a distinctive place in the organization. They have institutional knowledge that people rely on them for. And kind of humorously, they know where the bodies are buried. They know where all the bad stuff is. They know kind of what's happened. And so these are some of the ways in which we look at and consider who has power in the organization when we join. Now, one of the professors at University of California at Berkeley has done a lot of research on this topic of power. And what he says is, while people usually gain power through traits and actions that advance the interests of others, such as empathy, collaboration, openness, fairness, and sharing, when they start to feel powerful or enjoy a position of privilege, those qualities begin to fade. The powerful are more likely than other people to engage in rude, selfish, and unethical behavior. And this leads to what we call the Cookie Monster test. Basically, based on this test, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, people rise on the basis of their good qualities, but their behavior grows increasingly worse as they move up the ladder. This can happen surprisingly quickly. What happens is, and actually you can do this, and I've done this in some of my classes, you have groups of people, and you put in front of a group of, say, 4 people, a plate of 5 cookies. And then you identify one person in that group is the leader of the group, and you give them something to talk about. And then you encourage them to eat the cookies. What they found when they've done this study is that, who takes the remaining last cookie, because you've got 4 people and 5 cookies. Almost entirely the majority of the time, the person you appoint as a leader takes the 5th cookie. Oh, and what they've also noticed is that person was more careless in the way that they eat. They actually let crumbs going down their shirt, and they're less conscious of actually looking more appropriate in terms of how they're eating. So it's very, very interesting. And we also see that in ways that people, in terms of how they behave when they drive, in terms of what they drive. And what they found is this, that studies show that wealth and credentials can have a similar effect. In another experiment, drivers of the least expensive vehicles, in this example, the Dodge Colts, the Plymouth Satellites, always ceded the right of way to those pedestrians in a crosswalk. People driving luxury cars, such as BMWs and Mercedes, yielded only 54% of the time. Nearly half the time, they ignored the pedestrian and the law. Interesting. So what do we know? We also know this issue knows no boundaries, so it's not like a cultural construct of a particular country. In fact, surveys of employees in 27 countries, nearly 30 countries, have revealed that wealthy individuals are more likely to say it's acceptable to engage in unethical behavior, such as taking bribes or cheating on taxes. And this connects to the person who's driving the more expensive car versus the person who's driving the least expensive car, right? So what I like to use is this quote from Lord Acton. He knew what he was talking about. And this very famous quote, he says, "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely." And basically, this is an observation that a person's sense of morality lessens as his or her power increases. So that directly connects to the Cookie Monster test, as well as the whole notion of how the kind of vehicle that people drive and their behavior in terms of whether they pay attention to the rules of the road. Abraham Lincoln also said, in another interesting quote, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." And so that also is an interesting adage. And then finally, the Chinese proverb says, "Use power to curb power." So let's take a look at power. What is power in an organization? Organizational power is the ability that you have to influence the behavior of another stakeholder or person in your organization. So that could be, all different types of levels of people in terms of who resides in that organization. And your power is measured by the extent that you can influence to get that stakeholder to do something that he or she would otherwise prefer not to do. So it's actually getting motivated and getting them to do something like that. So let's look at the different types of power that exist. There's something known as formal power, and there's 3 different kinds of it. The first is coercive power. This is dependent on basically creating fear of negative results by somebody from failing to comply, and can include kind of demotion, suspension, or firing. So in other words, you're in fear that something negative is going to happen to you if you don't comply with what somebody is looking for you to do. Then there's the opposite. There's what's called rewards power, which is basically people comply because it provides positive benefits. You can get, extrinsic rewards, like you can get a pay increase, you're going to get a bonus, you're going to get a different job assignment, you might get travel, you would get other kinds of distinctions that would basically motivate you to comply because of the reward. And then there's what's known as legitimate power, which is the formal authority to take control of resources of the organization based on the position in the organization. So whether that's people, whether those are materials, technology, all of the, other kinds of resources, this gives person a legitimacy to the power because of that formal authority that they have. Then we have what's known as personal power. And this, we're going to talk about this later in the lecture because this is something that you can actually do something about. Expert power, which is influenced by wielding as a result of your own expertise, special skills, or knowledge, right? So we all know that person in the organization who has some kind of special skill set that we want to, that we need. And so people rely on them and they become experts in the organization. And that is a level of personal power. There's also referent power, which is your ability to influence others' behaviors as a result of being respected, admired, or liked. And we see this with people who have built up really successful relationships in organizations, really strong networks, whether they're inside or outside an organization. This referent power gives them a distinguished place in an organization. But what's the key to getting power? Dependence. People have a dependence, a level of dependence, and that level of dependence will actually kind of indicate the level of power that they have within an organization. So when one person is dependent on another person for something, then that second person has power over that dependent person, right? Dependency power increases when there are no options and you must interact with the powerful person in order to get what you need. And we see this play out in organizational life when people need favors from someone, when someone needs resources from someone, if someone needs expertise from someone. These are the ways in which we see this dependency increasing or decreasing depending upon who the person is in the organization. And so when we look at the balance or imbalance of power, sometimes dependency is balanced. So for example, when each person is needing something equivalent from the other person, even though what is sought may be different, they may have kind of a balance of power. But power can become unbalanced when power is asymmetrical. In other words, when one person is more dependent on the other, the person with the least dependency has the greatest power. Now, we see this played out in organizations as people change in the roles that they have, the responsibilities that they have, the reporting relationships that they have. So somebody's kind of power base and their dependency or lack of dependency can really change as they move forward in their career and in their organizational life. I like to use this piece from The Devil Wears Prada, which really shows kind of, and this is loosely based on the Vogue editor Anna Wintour. If those of you who've seen this piece, it really kind of shows a really interesting use of power. And then actually I like to think about it as a use of power by both people. Let's take a look.
Where are the belts for this dress? Why is no one ready?
Here. It's a tough call. They're so different.
Something funny?
No, nothing's, it's just that both those belts look exactly the same to me. I'm still learning about this stuff and,
This stuff? Oh, okay. I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. But what you don't know is that that sweater is not just blue. It's not turquoise. It's not lapis. It's actually cerulean. And you're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns. And then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets? I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
So what's very interesting about this piece is that, the Anne Hathaway character kind of disses fashion in the very beginning. I'm just learning about this stuff. And then Meryl Streep, in her powerful position, really takes her on and puts her in her place. I think that's a really excellent example of how we see power playing out real time in an organization. So when people are in a role of leadership, what are some of the power tactics that they use? So they can use the tactic of legitimacy, relying on your authority or position to actually exude the level of power that you want to basically showcase to other people. Or you can use rational persuasion, which is basically presenting logical arguments or factual evidence, which is a little bit about what Meryl Streep just did. She showed basically some logical argument in terms of why fashion was a really credible institution and why Anne Hathaway's position was really wrong. Or you can use an inspirational appeal, which is basically developing emotional commitments by those that you're appealing to, whether it's they're looking to their values, their needs, their hopes and aspirations. And so that actually you're trying to inspire them through that use of power. Or you basically consult with them. You use their involvement by increasing support, by involving whoever your target is, whoever that stakeholder is, and actually deciding how to accomplish what you want. So you actually rely on them. You get them involved with what you're trying to do. And of course, then they feel kind of a level of distinctive power themselves. Or exchange, you reward the target with benefits in exchange for something else. So if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. So that's an interesting way in terms of how that might work. Or you can use a personal appeal, which is asking for compliance based on friendship or loyalty. We sometimes kind of see imbalances of power in organizations when people have personal friends who work for them. And then, we might think that that friendship is actually kind of somewhat, has a really distinctive place because of the fact that there is this personal relationship and can actually change that power base. Or people might just use flattery, ingratiation, praise, tell people how great they are, tell them how brilliant they are, creative, whatever. We often see that, and we can sometimes see this as being disingenuous. Other times we can see it as actually being really, something that's actually fact-based, and they really believe in what they're telling the person that they're flattering. Or they can use pressure by using warnings, repeated demands, and even threats. If you don't do this, this will happen, right? Or they can actually build coalitions in terms of getting a group of people to basically persuade whoever that target is to actually do what they're looking for them to do. So these are really interesting power tactics that leaders and others may use in organizations to get people who are dependent on them to some extent to do what they're looking for them to do. So basically, how do we look at the application of these power tactics? So the effectiveness of them is reliant on your political skill, your ability to influence others to support whatever it is you're trying to get them to do. So with that, we look at the whole notion of organizational politics. We're not talking about Democratic or Republican politics here. We're talking about organizational politics, which is the use of power in organizations to influence decisions, and sometimes for self-serving and unsanctioned behavior. So it's, in other words, I could be looking for something specific that I'm looking to accomplish, and it may have nothing to do with what the organization is trying to accomplish. And they are informal, they're unofficial, and they're sometimes and frequently behind the scenes. And they could be to sell ideas, influence an organization, increase power, or achieve other objectives. And oh, by the way, they're not part of someone's job, but they are an attempt to influence. So it's not like written in someone's job description, being really good in terms of organizational politics. But they may be looking for people who are organizational savvy, which really connects to how people actually are or are not adept at navigating organizational politics. So what does it mean to be political? And sometimes we hear that term basically ascribed to an organization saying, it's a really political place. Saying someone is political generally stirs up some image of some person with some backroom dealing, they're manipulating others, or they have a hidden agenda for personal gain. And basically, a person engaging in these types of political behaviors is said to be engaging in what's called self-serving behavior that is not sanctioned, basically officially by the organization. It may be unofficially through kind of hidden agendas, but it's not an official kind of communicated outcome that the organization is looking for. What causes this? The root cause of political activities are often there's scarce resources, there could be time pressure, there might be other resources that are basically compromised. There could be structural inequalities both in an organization, such as a person's position in that organization. An individual can have their own personal motivations, whether they want to get ahead, they're extremely ambitious and aggressive, whatever, they engage in this kind of behavior, or there's unhealthy subcultures. We know that unhealthy subcultures happen when basically leaders and others engage in reward systems, whether they're kind of rewards that are positive rewards or negative threats. Subcultures can form when these kinds of values that are not sanctioned by the organization or behaviors are allowed to fester and are actually basically rewarded. That's where unhealthy subcultures can actually cultivate. And so what are we talking about? What are examples of self-serving behaviors. They could include bypassing the chain of command to get approval for something that you're trying to do, going through improper channels to obtain special favors, lobbying high-level managers just as before they make a decision, such as a promotion for a certain job, right? These types of actions undermine fairness. And fairness, as I've often said in a lot of my classes and to my clients, is one of the least appreciated behaviors. But to being fair is really, really tough in organizations. So have any of you ever experienced political disruptive behaviors in the office? Some of them could include sidebar conversations that are happening, right? And we're even seeing this, as we know, happen on Zoom, whether it's in the chat room, whether it's through email, through its other kinds of kind of online conversations. We also see it in terms of the level of engagement or disengagement people might have in terms of how they basically exhibit political or disruptive behaviors. Or people just flat out, they start rumors or they gossip about other people. The other thing is, questioning somebody's productivity and their achievement. Did you really do that? Or how did you really do that? Or was that really your work product? We've all kind of seen people who use those kinds of ploys. Or erosion of relationships that seem to happen in the background. So all of a sudden, this relationship that you thought you had seems to basically be dwarfed. And it's not the strong relationship that you might have had before. That could be actually a symptom of some kind of political or destructive behavior. Or toxic behaviors, such as passive aggressive, where people say one thing and they support you, or they say they're going to do something and then they don't do anything about it at all, or they don't follow up. You start seeing these kinds of political behaviors kind of exemplified in organizations. So what are some of the common political tactics? Someone who exercises great caution in seeking or giving advice. So, they're reluctant to tell you what they actually think. They maintain flexibility, but never completely commit themselves to any one position or program. So they're very, very cagey about kind of where they sit on an issue. They never communicate everything they know. They withhold information and they release it carefully. Why is that a political tactic? Because they're using that as a form of power. They're withholding information they know that you want and you need, and by not releasing it, it's basically showcasing their power. They accept compromise only as a short-term tactic while continuing to press ahead with what they want to do, with their agenda. Or they play favorites, or pitting one person against another to get what they want. In fact, sometimes leaders actually get people in a rivalry where they're actually, pitting one person against the other to get what they want. These are all very toxic things and political tactics that are basically exemplified in organizational behavior. And then we see some physical moves. Now, a little harder to do when we're in a kind of a remote situation, but even remotely, people can do certain physical dominant power moves. One of them is looking large. So when somebody actually kind of puts up their posture and kind of sits higher up or stands higher up and they seem larger than they are and more imposing, they can seem more powerful. Because why? They're taking up more physical space. Also, by their gaze, gazing directly at other people, especially while they're talking, and they don't tilt their head, they keep everything straight on, and they gaze directly at each person. You really can feel that power. Or they use really strong hand gestures, sometimes even with like a fist or an open hand, and you feel almost like this is a power move. Or they furrow their brows, right? Richard Nixon, the former president, was very famous for furrowing his brows a lot, a power move. Or they interrupt others, right? We see in some cultures, actually, interruption is more sanctioned than in other cultures, but it is a power move. Why? Because I'm stepping on what you say because what I have to say is more important. Or when something goes wrong, they react with anger rather than sadness. Why? Because anger is seen as a more powerful emotion than sadness. Or they just plain speak loudly. And sometimes you see even people when they're in a situation and they're in a room with other people and they want to seem more powerful, they start talking more and more loudly. Why? Because it gives them a position of dominance, and basically people can't not pay attention to them. So that is also another powerful move. or they reduce interpersonal distance. Now, not so allowable right now because we have to be socially distant, but basically what happens is people walk into someone's personal space and they get closer and they gaze directly and they use hand gestures and they may furrow their brows, and all of a sudden you've got a very powerful move going on from a physical dominance standpoint. And then we see the old, pat them on the back. You physically connect with lower people, lower level people, or lower powered people in an inappropriate way. Asymmetrical contracts. So, you can see oftentimes the CEO patting somebody on the back. They pat you on the back. Would you ever pat the CEO on the back? No, unless you are the CEO, right? But this is a power move. And this, when people do the patting on the back, that is absolutely considered a powerful move. And so it's not always kind of the friendly move we want to associate with it, but actually it's a move of dominance. So some of the things that you can do. So what do you do when you go into an organization? First of all, you need to read your organization's culture. Now, oftentimes this is not something that's achieved overnight. Usually, unless you know people in the organization and get kind of a read of that earlier, it takes time, and depending upon the complexity and the size and your position in the organization will depend upon how long it's going to take for you to figure out what's the culture of this organization that I'm in. The other thing is, one of the things that when people start feeling kind of lack of power, they tend to withdraw. Don't. In fact, do your job and do it well. That becomes really, really important. We start feeling powerless, we kind of sometimes feel like we have to retreat. That's a move that really diminishes the power that you do have. The other thing is you want to maximize your strengths, but minimize your weaknesses. But don't ignore your weaknesses. Be very mindful of what your weaknesses are, because people can play into them, but also understand what those strengths are that you actually want to kind of elevate and build up. Also, identify what your own sources of organizational power are and use them. And so who are the people that are, you can rely on? Who are the people that actually are in your corner? What are the resources that you have access to? Identify what your own sources of power is and know what that is. And then also evaluate the power structures in your organization and know who the powerful people are. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And understand that power can change even overnight. So we see this in organizations frequently when someone is in a position of power and then they fall in disfavor. The people that are closely aligned with this now person that has kind of fallen from grace get associated with that person, and now their power is actually affected. So you have to really be mindful of kind of how you're affiliating with others, their power structures, and how that can affect your own. As we look at mapping the power, and so as we think about mapping the power in organizations, we have to think about, when we go into an organization, figure out who's in power and actually chart it and understand it so that you can actually understand how you need to navigate, look at the relationships potentially that you need to build and be extremely strategic in terms of how you position yourself and build your relationships and your networks going forward. But remember, and this is really, really important, as anyone who's ever been on a relay team in running, the key to getting power is dependence. When you're on a relay team, every person on that relay has to be strong. We depend on each other. So by creating dependence, you're getting power. So let's talk about some of the things that you can do. So some of the things you can actually do are building on your personal power. So what do? You really get really good at communicating. Your communication skills become incredibly important in terms of building your positional power in an organization, how articulate and how expert you are at advancing those thoughts and ideas. The other thing, we just talked about that a little bit, is building your relationships and networks. And that's not just inside the organization, but outside the organization. If you're a person who's seen as being a really connected person with really powerful and strong relationships, that's really important. Sometimes organizations, you tend to become very insular and kind of focused on building your relationships inside the organization. That's important. But also important is building those external relationships so that people can see that you're highly regarded in the external world, which will bolster your own power position. The other thing is people need to see that you're a person connected with your character and your values, We talk about this a lot in terms of the strength of personal and leadership brands and why that becomes really important. So if you're known as a person with a strong character, affiliated with really strong values that you exhibit, this will basically bolster your own positional and personal power in an organization. The other thing, and importantly, we talked about this in terms of personal power, your own expertise, skill sets, and knowledge. What we've seen over the past year is some interesting changes in power in organizations as certain people have risen to positions of power because of their capabilities that surfaced in a remote environment. So you need to continually be looking at the skill sets that you're developing, how that is actually benefiting the organization, and how that becomes an essential resource to others as you actually bolster your own positional power relative to others in the organization. The other thing is you have to be open and flexible. So you have to understand that there may be new ideas or new aspects of your own self and your own power base that you actually need to look at in terms of building your own positional power. And of course, and always important, and we know that emotional intelligence is more important than our kind of intellectual quotient in terms of getting ahead in organization. EI becomes incredibly important, that you're actually being able to be self-aware and be able to advance those concepts in your interactions with others so that people actually, from a power standpoint, see you as someone who is in control and capable of effectively navigating an organization regardless of the situation. So the other thing is really building on your own reputational capital. I teach a class in reputation management at NYU at the graduate level. We talk a lot about the entire semester about reputation, but you have your own reputational capital that, aside from the organization that you're building. I tell people in my personal brand classes always, every interaction is an opportunity. As you look at building on your own reputational capital, this extends and advances your own ability to kind of advance your own power. Really, really important. But remember, there is no utopia. Office politics exists everywhere. The research on the extent of it is astonishing. So you think your organization is exempt from it? It's not. It's everywhere. It's just the extent and the type and the ways that it plays out in terms of organizations. And then, of course, if power is starting to corrupt you, if you start seeing yourself becoming corrupt, what do? Some of the things that are really important is practicing graciousness, practicing empathy. We've certainly seen this over the past year. The notion of gratitude, generosity, and always think like a stakeholder. I always advance in my classes. If you were experiencing you in a situation, what would that look like to the other person? When you start thinking about that, actually the way that you extend your power and how you actually create that and advance that will actually help you understand how you can actually rein it into a place where people are actually affiliating with you rather than running away from you. And the thing that's really important as we think about the notion of power is that small things matter. I think the notion that the former CEO of Campbell's Soup used to write 10 handwritten notes every day is a really interesting concept. The fact of the matter is that every person, regardless of culture and circumstances, wants to feel important. By doing that, by extending those kindnesses and those graciousness and those thoughts and ideas, you actually elevate your own power because people will affiliate with you, people will want to be connected with you, and people will actually have a higher regard for you. So these small things, these little kindnesses, these empathetic things that you can do on a continual basis, just try doing like one of them a day. You will start seeing that you will reap big rewards, not only in relationships and networks, but ultimately in your own personal and professional power. And as Brian Lowry at Stanford Business School said, you have to be careful with power, however. Think of it as fire. It's useful, but it's also dangerous, right? And finally, I'd like to leave you with the concept of a physician best-selling author who advanced the notion of basically how we see ourselves. Our self-image sets the boundaries of our own accomplishments. So that becomes important in this conversation as you think about your power. Think about how you actually see yourself and how you actually create your own kind of self-understanding and how you actually then extend that in terms of how you build those relationships, how you create that power, independency, and reliance, and your own stature within an organization. So with that, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions. And please connect with me on LinkedIn.
Actually, first of all, I'd like to thank you again for conducting this insightful presentation. And before we begin the Q&A session, I'd like to ask you to take a minute to answer our survey. We highly value your feedback, so please don't forget to complete it so we can keep improving our your event experience. And now we'll open the floor to questions. I think I saw already a few coming through the presentation. Let me see here. Let me read you the first one. Jacqueline, thank you so much for this lecture. Do you have any tips on how we can figure out the power dynamics or corrosiveness of a culture when we're interviewing at a company before it's too late and we accept the job in a toxic workplace?
It's a really important question. You know, sometimes we don't know until we get inside an organization, but there can be signals. And I think some of the aspects that you can look at is, first of all, how are you treated as a candidate? Don't forget, in the interview process, it's a two-way dynamic. They're interviewing you, but you're also interviewing them. There are some questions that you can ask in terms of getting to understand how things work in an organization. So you can ask, how are decisions made here? What's the decision-making role that I'll have in this job? What are the values that you, which is a question that rarely gets asked in an interview. What are your values here? And then if they can answer that question, you'll know that. If they can't answer, that says something else. And the other question is, okay, then, you know, give me some examples of how your values are being lived in the organization, or what are the kinds of expectations that you have of me as a candidate so I can contribute to that. If you catch them really off guard, then I'll say something about the organization. But, you know, I think that really, I'm a huge proponent of values, of organizational values, and doing something about them. So that discussion becomes a critical moment to understanding what's this organization really, really like. The other thing that if you're going to be a leader in an organization and you're going to be managing a team that you're coming into, and this has happened to me in my career, ask to, before you take the job, go out to lunch with your team. And, you know, they can interview you, but you can also interview them. Find out if you're inheriting a toxic team, a problematic team. You know, or if somebody wanted the job that you're interviewing for. I mean, you can see all kinds of interesting behaviors play out in situations like that, that'll inform you, what are you actually walking into? So I think some of those things might help you assess kind of what, you know, how the organization really operates and how you consider the behaviors that exhibit themselves through power moves.
Fantastic. We have another question here. Is there any interaction that isn't in some way political?
Well, I'd like to say yes. You know, we can't all be perfect people and like think about everything that we do all the time. And if you do that, you're going to become very, very, very almost robotic or, you know, very prescribed. So I'd say no. I think there's some real, you know, being real is really important, and that's how people feel comfortable with you. But there are people that are very studied and very careful about what they do. And, you know, I've had people like that. I've worked for people like that. I've had people who like that work for me. And you know, there's just very, very conscious of kind of what they're doing and what they're saying, and they're very careful. We tend to not be really comfortable with people like that, right? Because it seems so off-putting. So I would say that there are people that are real, that have an ability to be kind of showcase who they are, tell jokes, feel comfortable, have a lighthearted moment. I think those are the people that are real are the people that actually have the strongest relationships and people feel most comfortable with.
I absolutely agree. We have another question from Kristen. Does gender influence the efficacy of physical dominance power moves?
I don't know whether the research, so I'm not an expert on the notion of whether gender plays a role in power, but we know that from earlier studies that when women get powerful, they do some of the same things that men have done in terms of power. Some of the research shows that out. I mean, I have been connected to the topic of sexual harassment for a very long time. And so that's one area that I'm very familiar with. And we've seen that play out in terms of how women use power and how men use power. I would like to think that all of us have become more enlightened, especially in recent years, in terms of, how we talk about organizations and what's important and how we treat each other. I think people have become a lot more mindful of toxic behaviors, of political maneuvers, and how that can really affect the organizational results.
Okay. Let me see. We have here, Gabriela would like to know if you can give an example on how to minimize your weaknesses to further understand how to apply it.
How to further minimize your weaknesses. Well, one of the things is to really maximize your strengths, right? So to really get whatever your strengths are, to really elevate the notoriety of those strengths. If you're really good, if you're an outstanding writer, if you're an outstanding researcher, if you're an outstanding analytical thinker, any ways that you can distinguish yourself in those ways that people can sit up and take notice. So that becomes overshadowing to the weaknesses that you have. However, if the weaknesses become more important to your organization in terms of that weakness, and that becomes a skill set that's really important to the organization, you need to be aware of that. And sometimes, what I've seen really successful people do is, even if they've been weak at a certain thing, they get less weak about it. So they become more capable. They've taken it on almost as something that they want to basically learn and become better at. And that says an awful lot about their character and their willingness to change as well. So that's something to consider in this process.
Fantastic. Bartholomew would like to know if you recommend the book, The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, as a good resource for additional perspective. And also if there's any other books that you would like to recommend.
I can put the books that I recommend. I can send them to the AMA in New York and give them. I haven't read this book, The 48 Laws of Power, but I think that there's, I think I think the first thing is people need to understand how organizations work. So there's a lot of organizational understanding that people need to have. I see this particularly because I teach at the graduate level. Some of my students have been in organizations, some of my students haven't been in organizations. Nothing replaces organizational experience to kind of get this. You can't really tell somebody how it is. What you can do is you can read about other people's experiences and then understand some tactical things that you can do. The other thing that I really am a strong proponent is get, emotional intelligence is one of the most important things. I can look back on my own career and say, boy, I really could have used a dose of it. And I really could have learned a lot more understanding of what that means. So I think the whole notion of self-awareness is really, really critical. And people that are really good at that tend to do extraordinarily well overall from a leadership perspective. So that is another aspect in terms of how you think about it. The other thing that I would say that it's really good to learn from some of the things that have happened that have actually, leaders that have failed or organizations that have failed, that you can look at, and there's a number of books and documentaries that have been done in the last couple of years to look at where did they go wrong and what can I take from this in my own experience. I mean, we all know in our own lives, we learn a lot more usually from our failures than from our successes. Why? Because we reflect on it a lot, and we think about it, we dissect it, and we say, oh, that's something that I could actually move forward with based on what I've learned. So I think that there's an opportunity also to do the self-reflection in terms of, looking at this. One of my friends at Columbia, he keeps a diary. Every day he writes a diary of his learnings. This guy's amazing. And his name is Todd Churches, and he's written a book called Visual Leadership, which came out last year. And, one of the things that I think is really interesting that we can learn from what Todd does is he actually reflects on himself and situations. I think all of us can actually learn from that. I haven't started my own diary yet, but I have a goal of doing that. But these are things that we can actually reflect on. So it's not just reading about others, but it's actually learning to read our own selves. I think we don't do enough of that, reflecting on ourselves in a constructive, positive way.
That's a great suggestion. And we'll share that list of books on the thank you email.
List of books and list of podcasts. I got a list, and movies.
Fantastic. How should a powerful but empathetic leader would be described? Can you give an explanation of what traits she or he could demonstrate?
A powerful leader, power is, I'm not quite sure whether you're looking at kind of power overall or somebody who's abusing power. I mean, when somebody is in power, I think, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning of this lecture. We talked about the things that make people powerful. And so I think those are some of the things in terms of dominance, reliance, all those things in terms of how they actually, their authority and the regard that other people have for that individual. That's how power is actually kind of exhibited and basically consumed by other people. So those are some of the telltale signs. Sometimes people can surprise you with a power. I can remember being in an organization once where there was a guy, and I talked about this in terms of people that have power that you won't expect. There was a guy that, I could never understand how he was this quote unquote untouchable, which I mentioned earlier in the lecture. And he was this person that had, basically this great job, and nobody could actually, I could never figure out why he did. It turned out that when these investigative reporters were showing up at the facility that he was working at, and everyone was terrified of dealing with these reporters, he was the only person who went out and actually talked to them. And as a result of that, the CEO of the company basically said, this guy is, he was not afraid. He was willing to, he wasn't a coward. He dealt with the reporters. He dealt with the situation. And as a result, I'm going to always have a great place for him in the organization. It's an interesting story. And it actually happened. Those kinds of things happen in organizations where people are willing to basically stand out and, basically take on something when no one else will. So bravery and courage, sometimes in the face of fear, when other people are, can actually make somebody distinguished from a power standpoint as well.
Great. A few more. How should you respond when you are the recipient of poor behavior from others? The power moves based on self-interest.
Well, a little bit more information would help me with this question. So could you repeat the question again for me so I make sure I hear it correctly, Esther?
I'll repeat it. Maybe Taguchi would like to clarify the question. How should you respond when you're the recipient of poor behavior from others? Their power moves based on self-interest.
Well, first of all, it depends on who these people are. If they're your boss's boss, a peer, your team, hard to know. Because obviously organizational kind of where you sit in the organization and where they sit in the organization becomes an important part of the discussion in terms of how you want to respond in that situation. So you have to be mindful of who this is and what they're doing. The other thing is you have to examine maybe their motivations behind what they're doing. Is there anything related to what you're doing or not? And you kind of have to understand where that is coming from. Once you understand where the origin of this behavior is coming from, if you can, then you might be able to get the root cause and deal with it. It's really hard. People avoid confrontation in organizations. People avoid controversy. Talked about this with these sessions and in my classes. People don't like it. So to basically confront the person who's behaving badly towards you, sometimes can be very difficult and can actually destroy the relationship that you do have. So it has to be very, very well navigated in terms of what that is. If I had a little bit more information, and it's kind of hard to share in a forum like this what the specifics are, but you have to be very careful in understanding the origins of where it is and then how you want to confront it based on where that's coming from.
Great. We have a couple more questions from Erin. What would you recommend to someone looking to increase persuasion skills with fairness and balance?
I think that, I'm a strong proponent of looking at the rhetorical triangle from Aristotle. I mean, he knew what he was talking about. So if you look at ethos, pathos, and logos, and those three elements and how you persuade people, I think that's a really, really excellent kind of format to look at how you become persuasive, what types of arguments work. The other thing, and we talk a lot about this in stakeholder understanding in my classes and my clients and in my writing, is that, you have to understand who are you trying to persuade and what motivates them. Frequently, we go after kind of influencing somebody by something that we think would influence us. Well, it may have no bearing on the person. So actually you have to consider who you're trying to influence, what will actually connect with that person and influence them, and then how you can actually create an argument, your own rhetoric that can actually influence that person. So, and I think if we go about this as marketers, we do this a lot. We have to understand who is our target and what motivates that target. And there's lots of different factors that can play into that. But understanding what kind of motivates that person, where they're coming from, and then how you can construct that argument that actually plays to that stakeholder will then actually help you influence that person much more.
That makes sense. And the second question was tips on how to maintain context on self-awareness of your own power.
Well, some of the things that I shared with you in the lecture in terms of how you consider your own power. Self-awareness is something that you can actually get better at. It's like critical thinking. It's not like you're born, some people are innately more emotionally aware, but you can cultivate that. And we know through the research that the more you cultivate emotional awareness, the the less conscious you have to be about doing it. So I think that, first of all, you have to practice self-awareness in terms of that. The other thing is in the self-reflection, you need to look at that list of basically how to build your personal power. And don't underestimate the value of that, particularly the reliance on the skill sets that you have in distinguishing yourself within an organization, whether it's your skill sets, whether it's your strong relationships, whether it's your character and values, what's your ability to communicate. All those things are really critical to how you actually establish yourself very succinctly in an organization and basically create yourself your own position of power that can grow over time into a very, very, very strong thing. I've seen it happen. I've seen people's power, people who've worked on their power, people who've worked on their emotional awareness and kind of a whole understanding of their capabilities built on that. I've seen people build a very, very powerful position over time, and it's remarkable. Similarly, I've seen people basically destroy their power by not staying up with things, with not being connected to organizational strategic imperatives, and becoming less relevant. And that's another important point that's important to keep in mind is how relevant are you to the organization? How up with you in terms of what we're trying to accomplish? How reliant are people on you because of your relevance, right? That becomes really critical. Especially as marketers, we know this absolutely.
Yeah, it's definitely important to be aligned with the company. We have time just for one more quick question. Corinne asks, what if you wanted a job transfer or promotion and they chose an external candidate? What would you do?
Well, it's hard to know why they do it. I just had a student in one of my classes and that happened to her. First of all, I think if you think you absolutely deserve the job, that's one conversation to have. The second thing, I don't know whether you were interviewed for the job or even considered, so I don't know whether what happened in this situation. The other thing you can look at this as a moment, what they quote unquote say a teachable moment. What does this person have that they brought in that I don't have? There may be some real factors that they had that you don't have that you actually fell short on. So that's one thing. And then, then if it doesn't seem like that, then you have to kind of take stock and say, are there things that I should need to be building? Do I really have a career in this organization? I mean, one of the hardest things in anybody's career is knowing when to leave. And so that becomes, in this moment, it's really hard to leave organizations because of what we're living in. But under more regular circumstances, I would say that, self-reflection and whether or not you continue to have a career in a place becomes an important part of how you consider whether you should stay or where you should go based on these kinds of things that happen in organizations. Organizations are not perfect places. They have their imperfections, just like us as individuals. And not always the right person or the best person gets the job. And we've seen that played out in organizations too.
That's true. Well, thank you so much again for such a great advice. I hope that you have all found this conversation engaging and also practical so that you walk away with actionable steps on how to better recognize and navigate power and politics in the workplace. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week.